Hello, all. I'm Sarah Cowgill, and welcome to a special edition of Liberty Nation's Conservative Five. With the war in Ukraine nearing its second year and hostilities in the House of Representatives putting into doubt how much further funding to the beleaguered nation will become a burden for the American taxpayer, it's time to look at the whole situation with an analytical eye. Jumping in the hot seat this week and grabbing the steering wheel is Liberty Nation's managing editor, Mark Angelides. And he's here to give us a little bit of a preview for this very important show. Mark.
Hi,
well,
Sarah.
Let's go. Tell me who you've chosen for this panel discussion and why.
So for this particular special edition, I've chosen Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and founder, Mr. Tim Donner, because he has such a wealth of knowledge in terms of the political interplays that are taking place. And as I think we'll find in the discussion, one of the big questions as to how and if Ukraine can achieve victory will be taking place. These decisions will be taking place in America, not on the battlefield, not in Russia, not in Ukraine, but in how much further support is the American taxpayer and their representatives are willing to provide to the war effort, because essentially once the cash dries up, that's the end of the war in terms of getting new armaments and new possibilities for war fighting of all different descriptions. And
America is not the only people holding this Band-Aid on, are they?
That's true. Yeah, there's the NATO alliances are also putting money in, but as with the United Nations and NATO, America is, as always, the biggest funder, and that's courtesy of the American taxpayer, of course. And we've also got Dave Patterson on the show, who is an expert in all things military, and so he's going to really give us some great details there.
I'm so looking forward to it, and I know I've talked to a lot of people in my circle of viewers, and they are excited for this because they wanted something a little more in depth with C5 that could go into a little more detail, and I think this is exciting. Okay, well, we're all looking forward to it. Over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome to Liberty Nation's Conservative Five with a twist. The twist being that with our guest today, Mr. Tim Donner, senior political analyst of LibertyNation.com, and Mr. Dave Patterson, former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller and Air Force pilot, they make two guests each. So therefore, for those of us going 2 + 2 = 5, is we do the maths ourselves. And welcome to our Conservative Five special edition on the Ukraine war. Now, I've invited these two guests in to join me, your host, Mark Angelides, specifically because they have a unique set of analytical skills. Dave is an expert in all things defense and military. Tim has a keen political mind in terms of political analysis to look at the interplays between state actors and foreign and domestic situations like none other. And me, I'm just here because I fill in the blanks. So, gentlemen, thanks for being here.
Great to be with you, Mark.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
So I think maybe for the first off, if we get our situations, our perspectives on the Ukraine situation, the war in Ukraine as it sits today, and maybe put out a couple of things that you'd like to discuss further on that. Let's start with Dave. Dave, you've been writing on the pages of LibertyNation.com about this war from, in fact, before the war started, pointing out what's about to happen. And for anybody who thinks the State Department couldn't have known, well, they should have just read LibertyNation.com. Dave, what's your take as we approach almost 2 years in the war?
Well, I think the big battle is going to be the biggest battle is, of course, within the United States and the Biden administration's fight with Congress over money. And
sorry, Dave, I'm gonna jump in and interrupt straight away. So the biggest battle here, you mean that Ukraine can't continue to wage its defensive war against Russia without American support? Is that the angle we're coming at?
Yeah, well, that's what the Biden administration would like you to believe, and the problem is that they've crafted the argument wrong. They blame Congress for dragging its feet over the what is now $111 billion that's been, as the Office of Management and Budget said in a letter recently to Congress, that's been allocated. But it includes, 67 billion for military procurement funding and 27 for economic and civilian assistance, and it's that tranche, this 27 billion, that is really stuck in Congress's craw, because it funds basically the administration and the government of Ukraine, to include things like pension funds and the salaries of government workers, and then there's 10 billion for humanitarian aid. But the issue really is that the Biden administration has never, not one time, explained what their strategy is and how that money is going to eventually end up in some sort of end state that will be of mutually beneficial, or at least give Ukraine some satisfaction that the losses of all their people have been worth it.
That's yeah, I really think that as you say, the 27 billion that's being used to fund politicians' pensions whilst war's being waged there, and it's the politicians that are, you'd imagine that they're in this position of great responsibility, but it's something that they asked for. They didn't accidentally get elected to office. They sought this knowing full well, and that they should be fighting without having to worry about, well, what about my 401k? What about my nest egg? It's a terrible, it's terrible optics, isn't it? Which I guess brings us to the political. Tim, what's your take on it?
I'll tell you what, when it comes to funding for Ukraine, the combination of globalists, neoconservatives, establishment Democrats will try to make the argument that as much as we've spent on Ukraine, which, as Dave pointed out, is over $110 billion, it's only 3% of the defense budget. So that by itself is used as a defense for continuing to fund Ukraine. I mean, look, the fact is, and I think everybody believes this, most of all the voters, no idea where this money is going, how it's being spent, whether it's going down a rat hole. Americans are already very wary of foreign aid. We have troops stationed in over 100 countries across the globe. The defense budget is enormous, which by itself makes spending a mere 110 billion on Ukraine appear to be not really such a huge investment. But I think from a political standpoint, the question that people need to be asking more than anything else is, as we approach the 2028 election.
2024. You're predicting the war is going to continue till 2027.
Well, I think we already have the outlines of the 2020 campaign with Ron DeSantis.
Gavin Newsom,
Gavin Newsom having had their debate last week. But the question people need to ask themselves as they consider who they want to be the president come January of 2025 is, would Ukraine have been invaded by Russia if Donald Trump was in the White House? And too many times people do not ask this question. During the Bush years, Putin made his incursion into Crimea. He later made an incursion into Georgia. Actually, it was Georgia under Bush. And then an incursion into Crimea under Obama. And then a full-scale invasion of Ukraine under Biden. What do you see missing there? You see the Trump years, the 4 years Trump was in office. Putin was put back in his box to some degree. Now, people can argue why, but the fact is we had peace beyond all measure compared to the rest of the 21st century when Donald Trump was president. And he has played a little bit close to the vest as to how he would handle the war in Ukraine. But I think the point is we had no wars under Donald Trump, and now we have two grinding ground wars under Joe Biden. And it's almost impossible to separate those two ground wars from the weakness of Joe Biden.
I'd like to come back on that, Tim. So I think that's a really good point. You're right. People don't ask the question about why didn't this happen under Donald Trump? And if they do, they're dismissive, saying it just wasn't the right time, or because Putin already had his man in the White House, which is the most disingenuous of responses to there. But I'd like to put forward my opinion on why he didn't do anything during the Trump years. And that's simply because Donald Trump would see no value in extending the conflict, because he wouldn't. Now, that's not to say that Donald Trump would be strong enough to push back at Vladimir Putin, because we don't know that for sure. We can't know that for sure. But there's no advantage for Donald Trump to become a wartime president. There's no political advantage in that for him. So for Trump, I mean, we look at him with the Abraham Accords, which arguably, Joe Biden has been ignoring up until this point because he didn't want to give Donald Trump the credit for the Abraham Accords. And look what happened. We end up with a war in Israel.
In fairness, that's not entirely true, because Biden was trying to bring Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accord universe, so to speak. And of course,
but not the Abraham Accords. He wanted the Biden Accords,
of course not.
So the good work done under the Abraham Accords. But anyway, we digress to the Israel situation. But what we do know is that Donald Trump wouldn't have seen a political benefit in being a wartime president, because he was already popular among his own party. And whereas with Joe Biden, there is an advantage for him to be seen as a wartime president because the economy is tanking.
Well, let's go back to the South Carolina primary in 2016, when Donald Trump was up against a gaggle of opponents, including, Jeb Bush and Ted Cruz and all the rest of them. And Donald Trump said right there in front of a fully Republican audience, essentially, that George W. Bush was, if not a war criminal, someone who had started a war that was entirely unnecessary. He laid his so-called, I suppose you'd call it, pacifist credentials on the line. And I remember watching it and saying, I think Donald Trump just lost the South Carolina primary, because you can't go into a Republican primary and attack the last Republican president. Well, Trump went on to win by 10 points in South Carolina. And I think that gave him the clear message that his voters and voters in general are sick and tired of war and incursions into other countries and expanding conflicts and getting the U.S. involved at any cost. And Joe Biden has always been suspected of not seeing a war that he doesn't like. So, he's got quite a burden to carry.
Or a foreign policy decision he wasn't ready to blow up.
Well, look, here was, Dave, I was struck, and I got to get your reaction to this. And it doesn't regard Ukraine particularly, but you have to assume that the reaction was largely the same within the Biden administration with Ukraine when Biden was talking with Putin. You go to Iran during the Israeli war and you're asked, John Kirby, the State Department spokesman, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, the president, what is your message to Iran? One word: don't. Don't. They kept repeating, don't. Dave Patterson, do you think that is an effective strategy to deter Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the rest of the savages who attacked Israel on October 7th.
No, of course not. I mean, this administration has a propensity to be too cute by half. This idea of just, don't. Well, I mean, honestly, I think going back to your discussion about would Trump have, it's always dangerous in doing hypotheticals. But if you see Trump, former President Trump, as a transactional pragmatist, in other words, he is always about the transaction, the discussion, the deal, if you will. When the first 60,000 troops showed up on Ukraine's border, he would have gone into the transaction then. He would not have just simply said, oh, look, isn't that nice? I mean, they can move their troops to a neighbor's border. No, that was the time when the sanctions should have been put in place. That is the time when the United States and NATO should have had an exercise to demonstrate exactly what would happen if
an exercise, yes.
Right.
But instead, what Biden said was, well, if it's just a minor invasion, we're not really going to
minor incursion.
I mean, that's just incredible. It's incredible that a president of the United States, in this case, the commander in chief, could say, well, as long as the incursion isn't too big, I don't think we're going to do anything about it. Boy,
well Tim, actually,
to the world.
The loss of Luhansk and Donbass and the Crimea in Biden's calculus would be a minor incursion, right?
Right. Yes.
And
since they're mostly Russian-speaking residents there anyway, it's largely Russian. It belonged to Russia for a long time, so we can just let them take it back.
I haven't forgotten the 600 who fought to save the Crimea in the charge of the Light Brigade. I haven't forgotten them. Sorry, Dave. Continue with your point.
Yeah, well, I think that the point was that throughout that first year, 2021, Biden had opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to make the case to Putin in a way that would have been very strong and unyielding. And what did he do? He failed to make the case before the June meeting, his summit meeting with Putin. And then after, what did the two sides do? In July, Putin puts out his manifesto, which tells the world precisely what he's going to do and why. And Biden stops military aid to Ukraine. I mean, that was unbelievably foolish by any manner of measure. And then, of course, he goes on to screw up Afghanistan. And the point, I guess, is that all of this Biden nonsense in foreign policy has left the American people with absolutely no confidence whatsoever in the geopolitical capability of this administration, and rightly so.
And here's the thing, Dave, it's only been compounded with the response to, over 70 targeted attacks on Americans and American facilities in this broader Israel-Hamas war with Iran being involved. I mean, we have had our troops targeted. We had Americans killed on October 7th. We have Hezbollah playing footsie with northern Israel. We have Hamas refusing to let so many of its civilians out of Gaza, sending them to their certain death. All of this. And what does the Biden administration do? They bomb a bunch of empty storage facilities in the middle of the night. You know what? Of the possible responses, and you could talk better on this, Dave, but of the possible responses, this to me was the worst possible response because it sends the message that Joe Biden is a coward when it comes to foreign policy. He does not have the guts to engage a declared enemy of the United States. And what more can you say if you have a president who isn't willing to engage a fight when his country is being taunted, literally taunted by Iran, and he can't respond to it? It would have been better, in my opinion, if he did nothing and sent the message that he was preparing a major response. But by these little pinpricks, and that's even a generous term, he's sending the message that we're not really willing to do anything to accept our responsibility that we've made to Israel and to our people to keep them safe there and here.
Okay, we're going to address that as soon as we get back after this short break. Don't go anywhere. And we're back on this special edition of Liberty Nation's Conservative 5. C5 for those in the know, C3 because it's a special edition. Now, earlier in the show, Tim Donner, he was discussing the, as you called it, the pinprick reactions of Joe Biden to the more than 70 different attacks against U.S. Forces and installations since the broader war began over in Israel. And Dave, I'd really like to come back on that and tell us a bit more about Joe Biden's overall response, not just to Israel, which is kind of off topic for the Ukraine one, but it is an important data point, I think, but also to Ukraine and how Joe Biden is promising America that there's no end in sight.
I think that to your point, there are two things I think you need to understand. That what the Biden administration, and that's to a person, yeah. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, pick your favorite, Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State. It doesn't matter. They're all in lockstep with this notion that you can get your end state by incrementally. In other words, look at what they did in Afghanistan. That was an incrementally botched operation. Again, Ukraine asks for weapons to defeat Putin's soldiers when they're just coming across the line. And what does Biden do? He doesn't give them the list of things from the get-go. He parses it out. And not only that, but you'll recall when President Zelensky wanted used MiG-29s, Poland said they would give them to him, and the United States said no, until they said yes. And the same thing with Abrams tanks, Patriot missile systems, HIMARS, the multiple launch rockets. It is the same approach constantly, and it doesn't work. These people are insane. And as we know, doing the same thing over and over and getting the same results is insanity. And they demonstrate it over and over and over. And it's like, oh, look what we've done new. No, it's the same stuff that didn't work.
If you think back to Biden's disastrous withdrawal, which I actually call it surrender, in Afghanistan.
Well, sorry, Tim, if I may, it took 4 presidents, trillions of dollars to hand power from the Taliban to the Taliban.
That's true. And I'm sure the American people believe it's a worthwhile investment, Mark. But my point is that Afghanistan was a wildly unpopular war by the time that Biden ended it. And so the initiative to withdraw from Afghanistan should have been immensely popular. There's any number of ways we could have withdrawn from Afghanistan where Joe Biden could have taken a victory lap for removing us from a 20-year-long war, which had become something the American people were no longer interested in, engaged in, or even knew much about. But instead, he picked the one way to withdraw from Afghanistan that would just blow up make him and the country look foolish, unprepared, and essentially make Biden look like he was in way over his head as commander in chief. And a reminder that, the first two times he ran for president, he had to withdraw. The first time because of plagiarism, and the second time he didn't even reach 1% in Iowa. So the voters had weighed in on Joe Biden long before 2020. It's just that in 2020, he presented himself not as Joe Biden, but as not Donald Trump. And he managed to somehow land in the Oval Office. But I just think, just like with Jimmy Carter in the decline of his presidency, that the American people sniff, they smell weakness in this president. And there's really nothing he can do about it except to pull out of the race. And he's given no indication that he plans to do so, because he still believes he's the only one that can beat Donald Trump.
Speaking politically on this, Tim, I think you have a very good point, but it seems to me that, and this is pure speculation on my part, but it seems to me that Joe Biden is determined to pull a win out of Ukraine to benefit himself. And as such, he's not willing to let Ukraine come to a peaceful solution on its own terms.
Well, talk about a fool's errand.
Yeah,
I mean, he thinks he can get a victory from the war of attrition.
Yeah.
The war of attrition that Ukraine has turned into. There are no big dramatic events. It's a grinding ground war that's not, Dave, disagree with me if you will, but do you see an end to this war within the foreseeable future?
No, I don't. Unless, which is a big unless Biden is replaced by a Republican who has some sense of what strategy looks like and what an end state is and can communicate that to the American people. I think that what you're seeing now, and it's a microcosmic view of how people look at the Ukraine in the United States. And this one, there are lots of examples, but the first one that comes to mind is, if you were intent on making sure that every dollar of the American taxpayer's dollar was spent wisely, don't you think that you would be in favor of a special inspector general like we had in Afghanistan and Iraq to monitor and audit what's going on? And the Biden administration has rejected that and been against it consistently. They say that, USAID, the State Department aid distributor, the Department of Defense and State Department, they have inspector generals that are doing the job wonderfully. The fact is that I'm told by colleagues in Ukraine, they aren't even in residence in the embassy. They're over in Poland, and come, every now and then show up. They're kind of doing their business remotely, and then they turn around and say, "Oh yes, all of the materials that we have looked at are being used for the purpose that we sent them." Well, that's hogwash. You need to have somebody on the ground in the embassy and out watching where things go. And that's what we did in Afghanistan and what we did in Iraq. And, people may not have liked it because, the gag was up, but that's how at least we managed to ensure the taxpayer dollars were spent wisely.
Let's come back to both of you actually on this next question. You say about if there were somebody in the White House who understood strategy. Now, we have the election coming up, but of course, before that, we've got the primaries as well, the Republican primaries and the Democrat primary that's not even happening by the looks of it. But you have somebody like, for example, Nikki Haley, who, to my mind, Tim and I joked about this a little while ago. The 2007 called, they want their politics back. The Republican Party wants its politics back, Nikki Haley. But it seems that she's very much in favor of a full-bore approach to dealing with Russia on behalf of Ukraine, dealing with Hamas on behalf of Israel. Now, do you see that as an escalation that is dangerous for getting American troops involved? Because I think what everybody who's not involved in the actual decision-making process wants is to avoid Americans losing their lives to these wars.
Well,
Dave.
look, the context of the war has changed substantially ever since October 7th. Now Ukraine has just become the other war. There's that war too, because our attention is focused on the Middle East and trying to stop it from blowing up and establishing Palestine from the river to the sea. And I don't think in his heart of hearts, Benjamin Netanyahu has a whole lot of confidence in Joe Biden, because again, it's another product, I think, Mark and Dave, of the left's one-step thinking, where Joe Biden says this Afghanistan war essentially is a pimple on my butt, and I need to just remove it, and it'll go away, and it'll all heal over time. As if the one-step thinking, which is Afghanistan's a problem, well, just pull everybody out. No plan, essentially no plan for pulling out of a 20-year engagement for which thousands of people died, thousands more were injured. And there was also the sense that he had, by doing the withdrawal that way, he had demeaned the sacrifice of so many Americans who had fought in Afghanistan. He had essentially devalued what they had tried to do in Afghanistan. But the point is about Ukraine, as it carried over this same commander-in-chief, he has not even come close to making the case to the American people that Ukraine is essential to American security, national security. He's not made the case that Ukraine really should be supported by the tax dollars of a country that's in crisis itself, that needs all the help it can get on the domestic front. He has failed to make the case domestically at any level. You can see it in the poll numbers. People have disapproved of his handling of every element of foreign policy and war. He's underwater. He's below 40%. So the American people have already weighed in on it, and we'll see if they vote with their feet accordingly in November of 2024.
Dave, what do you make of
it? Expanding on that point, Tim, I think that because it's a very interesting dynamic when you look at how public opinion ebbs and flows, and that is that if a strong leader comes out and says, this is what we're going to do and why, the American people are more than likely going to say, okay, I may not like this, but I do understand it. And, you are the president. And so, we can get behind this. But when you have a weak leader who doesn't tell you what's in their mind, and one would argue that there might not be anything in Biden's mind, but if they're unwilling to explain what it is that they're doing and why, then the people will make up their own reasons. And particularly with Ukraine, they've done that already. They've made up their reason. And the reason is, why should we be in Ukraine when we've got this horde of illegals coming across our southern border, and we're propping up Ukraine's border and not our own? And that's the argument that they have come up with. But there is a case for us being very involved in Ukraine. And Putin makes this case over and over and over. He says, first Ukraine, then the Baltics, and I'm going to get the Soviet Union back. And he is working diligently. We may see this as a point solution for Putin in Ukraine. It is not. He wants the Soviet Union back.
Okay, but Dave, here's the question. Does Russia have the military capability to overtake actual NATO nations? Because, of course, Ukraine is not in NATO. But once he invades Poland, for example, now you are you're getting all of NATO involved. You're getting more than 30 countries jumping to the defense of a fellow NATO member. So my question to you is, when the context completely changes, if Putin tries to go beyond Ukraine, doesn't he face a whole different kind of challenge? And is the Russian military at this point really strong enough to take over Ukraine, and then expand beyond that?
It's not clear that he could, but the fact is he wants to. And if he wants to, then he'll do things that will help to achieve what he wants. And look at how they do their business. First of all, you start by destroying the institutions. You do that by cyber attacks. You do that by causing dissension and turbulence. And you slowly but surely destroy people's faith in their institutions. That's what they did in Georgia. That's what they attempted to do in Estonia. And that's what they did successfully, I would argue, in Ukraine, in the eastern portion of Ukraine. And then they start their march, and they'll break you from within. And so whether or not they have double the number of soldiers, it doesn't matter. That's not how they go about destroying you.
Yeah, it's very much a case of asymmetric warfare, Dave. Now, we'll be back talking Russia, Ukraine, and the end game here of what's involved very shortly after this break. Don't go anywhere. And we're back on this very special edition of the Conservative Five for LibertyNation.com. Obviously, there's only three of us. That's why it's such a special edition, because our guests are the most special of all, Mr. Tim Donner and Dave Patterson.
Can I break in
Please.
to say that makes each of us worth not one person, but 1 2/3.
Like Chevy Chase in Caddyshack, how do you judge yourself by other people? Height. So
we're each 1 2/3 of a person. That's how impressive we all are.
That's fairly impressive,
and very humble too.
Absolutely.
Or as Chris Christie might say, in quoting Stephen Wright, "I'm not afraid of heights. I'm afraid of widths."
Okay, so we've been talking about Joe Biden's response to the Ukraine war. We've been talking about the international response. And how this really fits into a broader foreign policy debacle. But for this last segment, what I really want to talk about, chaps, is a question that's bothered me pretty much since the beginning, and that is, can Ukraine win this war? And Dave, I know you and I have talked about this on Liberty Nation Radio before, but it's my contention that, and I could be entirely wrong, but that they really never could win this war by themselves, which is obviously why the NATO push behind it has been such a bulwark for them. But in reality, Russia is a beatable foe. It's lost, even in the last 100 years, it's been involved in a lot of conflicts that it's lost. More, I think 20 conflicts or 19 conflicts, where it hasn't been successful. So it is a beatable foe. But Russia has historically never really committed itself until it's thrown 500,000 lives at a war effort. And by any figures, even the admittedly inflated Ukrainian figures, which is where we're getting our figures from, they're nowhere near 500,000 lives yet. So to me, it seems that Russia hasn't really even committed fully to taking the provinces of Ukraine, the Donbass regions and Crimea. It seems as though, because if they really wanted to just go full out war, they'd start unleashing rocket barrages of huge bombs just at civilian populations, because it's a war, and they do it. And Ukraine is, as we pointed out in the last segment, is outside of NATO, so it'd be Ukraine against Russia. And that doesn't appear to me to be what Russia wants at the moment. Now, they might do that, but it seems to me that they're not even fully committed to winning yet. And already Ukraine's on the brink of not being able to fight.
I think that I would make 3 points. And the first is no one has established a definition of what winning means.
Yes.
And until you do that, you're just helpless in using any kind of weaponry or tactics. So you have to understand what winning means. Now, in wars in the past, winning has been two things really, and that is that either you trounce, completely destroy the war making and economy of your enemy, as was the case in World War II, or you make it so ugly for the opponent that they give up and go away, as the North Vietnamese did to the United States in the Vietnam War. And so those are the kind of the three things you need to think about. And so in defining winning, one might say, okay, look, you guys are just going to beat the crap out of each other until neither of you has any strength left, and Putin has indicated that he is not going to give up no matter what, and Ukraine, at the rate they're going, will have to give up because they don't have anybody left to throw into the battle. So it appears to me that a reasonable solution is that you broker a sit down where Putin says, okay, I can't lose face. I've wasted all these Russian young people in this war. I can't lose face. Okay, so what is it that they would absolutely draw a line on? Crimea would be one. Crimea has always been Russian, and okay, fine, you get Crimea. Donbass and Luhansk, on the other hand, not so much. I mean, you made a play on April 14th or in April of 2014. You got a significant swath of the Donbass and Luhansk Oblast. Okay, fine. But what we're going to do there is we're going to have that administered by some third party. Or you get what you were back when you started on February 24th. And the quid for Ukraine is they're immediately in NATO. So is that the right one? Who knows? But it's something. It's a starting.
It's a definition of winning, yeah.
It's a definition of winning. And right now, the Biden administration is hopelessly intellectually feeble in coming up with anything like that.
Sometimes winning from a political standpoint is simply declaring victory. Declaring that you won and leaving. Now, of course, you can't really do that in Korea. We couldn't do it in Vietnam. This one has kind of the feel of the Iran-Iraq war, in which the United States had a very difficult time deciding which side they would take in a war between two enemies of the United States. Now, of course, we don't have, Ukraine's not an enemy, and Russia is an adversary more than an enemy at this point in time. But a lot of this, I think, depends on the Russians' will to continue to fight through this long, dark, cold winter that is on the horizon very shortly. Do the Russians have the will to fight? Well, I thought that, honestly, that the sight of all the body bags coming back from Ukraine would turn Russian support for this war way down, that they would turn against this war, even if privately, because, of course, you don't attack Vladimir Putin publicly, or you find yourself in a great state of disrepair, if not dead. So it seemed that the Russian people would, in some sense, not only because of all the body bags, but because of the incredible investment of treasure by the Russian leadership, that they would turn against this war and eventually force Russia to pull back, that the economy would be so strapped because of this all-out war on its neighbor. But in fact, incredibly, it turns out that the Russian economy, while it wavered badly at first, has recovered. The economy has recovered. And the irony is that since Russia's invasion, Russian oligarchs have been prohibited from investing in many foreign vehicles. So what's happened is these Russian oligarchs have been forced to invest domestically, and that has boosted the Russian economy, ironically, in wartime. And I think it signals to Putin, it doesn't seem that any sort of domestic opposition to it will stand in your way.
Yeah, notably the pressures that the international community have put on Russia, because they were, like Dave pointed out in the first segment that we talked about, it was a very piecemeal approach to the sanctions. It allowed Vladimir Putin to build relationships, for example, with China. So
let's put something
everybody's paying Russia.
Let's put something in context too, in terms of Joe Biden, who's been around Washington for 50 years, his entire adult life. He has been a member, and a prominent member for many of those, of the swamp. Lest we forget, he was the only one of the brain trust, so to speak, of the Obama administration that opposed the raid to kill Osama bin Laden. Obama was for it. Hillary Clinton was for it. Everybody was for it except Joe Biden. So it shows that he's 1, weak, 2, cowardly, 3, wrong, or 4, all of the above. And for Democrats, 5, none of the above, because he has to beat Donald Trump in 2024.
And we're almost out of time now, gentlemen. But what I'd really like to do is just hand this over to Dave for the final summation with what I think is probably the most important question in terms of lives and treasure, as it were. And that's, Dave, when and how does this war end?
I think that the war ends when the American people decide that it's over. Enough is enough, and we're not giving another dime to support what's going on, regardless of whether it's worthwhile or not. The United States has a capacity to say, I'm stopping. They did it in Vietnam in 1975. Congress said not another dime goes to Vietnam, and they made it stick. And there is this underlying philosophical and emotional drive in America that simply says enough is enough, and we're not giving another dime. That's the more troubling end to it, because and we've done it before. We did it. Golly, we did it in Afghanistan, didn't we? Just recently, we just left. We pulled out of Bagram and left with no electricity. We just pulled out in the middle of the night, leaving the Afghan security forces to fend for themselves, which of course they couldn't. And so we have a history of doing this. That's one way that this all ends, unfortunately. The second way, of course, is that should an adult get into the White House next, and they simply force the negotiation. If we're indeed the powerhouse superpower that we think we are, and we enjoy meddling in other people's businesses, we force the negotiation, period. NATO comes on board, we show leadership, and it's a negotiated settlement, regardless of how it sorts out.
Dave, as I'm sure Napoleon, Caesar, and all the rest would agree, leadership is what wins battles. David J. Patterson and Tim Donner, thank you ever so much for joining us on this special edition of the Conservative 5, cut down to 3 because apparently we're worth 1 2/3 each, which is quite nice. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's all we have time for in this week's special edition of Liberty Nation's Conservative 5. You can read the analysis from Dave Patterson and Tim Donner on the pages of libertynation.com. Thank you for tuning in for free thinking, free speech, Liberty Nation.